I see all this potential, and I see it squandered. God damn it, an entire generation pumping gas, waiting tables, slaves with white collars. Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need. We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no Great War, no Great Depression. Our Great War is a spiritual war. Our Great Depression is our lives. We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't. We're slowly learning that fact. And we're very, very pissed off.
So my next guest is the author of the book Civilizationism, which is available on Amazon. He's a PhD student, active writer, husband and father. I'm talking about Moses Apostaticus. Welcome to Project Civilization.
Oh, hi, thanks for having me on.
So Moses, can you tell the audience a bit about how you came to write for the Daily Caller and XYZ? In other words, who is Moses Apostaticus?
Yeah, sure. Well, basically, my wife told me to just stop bothering her with everything that was wrong with the world, and either not care anymore or go and write for an audience about it, and so that was really the motivation. How I came to have the views that I have, which it's been great to see since I started writing. There are a lot of people out there who are all starting to think along the same wavelengths, because we're all noticing things. We're all noticing similar things. So I when I went to school, long time ago, last millennium now, isn't it? Yeah. I had the good fortune of having a few teachers who still taught in the classical fashion. They still taught in a way that would be considered a classical education. So I had one teacher I remember, she taught us our Greek and Latin roots, and she used to tell stories about the public school that she went to, public school meaning elite private school, in Scotland. And I had another history teacher who told us stories about his travels to Egypt and Italy. So that made me very interested in history. And when I went to university, I studied Latin and ancient history, as well as English literature. But what I found as I went along in my studies, and really I've been trying to figure it out in the 20 years since then, exactly what it was that was so wrong, was when I went into the Latin lecture hall or the ancient history lecture hall back then. It's since become corrupted, but what I was taught was empirical. It was based in evidence. It was what you'd call an inductive way of thinking. You start with the evidence and you draw conclusions from that, and then you test your conclusions, and you're ultimately searching for truth. But when I went into my English literature subjects, or at least most of them, it was very different. And I was not compatible with it back then, and I didn't understand what was so different. But for those subjects, and this is now the case across the education system outside of science and medicine and engineering, what the way of thinking was very different. That there was a set of preconceived beliefs and dogmas which had been accepted by all of the lecturers and professors in those departments. And the purpose of those subjects was to impart those preconceived views to the students. And so the game for students became, and now this is the case across our education system, it became being the best at absorbing and regurgitating, and being the most clever at playing with those preconceived dogmas. And we could call those dogmas, I guess, critical theory, postmodernism. There's lots of different names that we could call it, but that's what it was. So then I travelled a little, lived overseas, lived in Asia for a few years, and that's important because when I lived in Korea, and when I was there, I lived in a conservative culture, and I could see that it functioned in ways that ours doesn't. That conservative, rather hierarchical, traditionalist culture, they had a better insight into how to be a healthy society than we did. And when I came back to Australia, I was puzzled by that, and that also fit into my experience during education. So I became a teacher, and over the years, that problem that I had when I was in university, where I was incompatible with some of those subjects, only got worse. And now, if you're a traditional thinker, if you're sane, pretty much, you're going to struggle in the more politically sensitive areas of teaching at a primary, secondary, or tertiary level, and I think that's part of why I've become as I guess some people would consider me radical, but why I'm so adamant about the views that I have. It's because this has been a lived experience, and working in education, seeing how education operates to indoctrinate rather than educate, it definitely made me want to pull the alarm bell on where our culture and our society is headed. And for me, writing is a good way to do that. For other people, there are other ways, but writing and also producing videos and whatnot, I could definitely see as a way that I could join in this fight for Western civilization, which is how I see it.
So, moving on to the cycle of civilizations, unknown to most people, historically there's always been a pattern to each human civilization. Basically, we start at the beginning with good solid values at the pioneering phase, and at the end in stage 6, we collapse at the decadent phase, where private and public debts are basically exploding out of control. And if you look at where we are today in 2017, well, surprise, surprise, most nations around the world have terminal debt levels, both privately and publicly. So to provide a bit more context, we can actually look at where we're going in terms of our civilizations by using causal loop diagrams, which are made up of reinforcing and balancing loops. And these can actually show us what the results will be if we inject too much into a system. Now, causal loop diagrams could actually be used to model anything from, say, boiling water in a saucepan to even a man-made system like a banking system. So Moses, what do you see coming?
Yes, well, so I guess Australia is in a unique situation, isn't it? So it's probably good to talk about the local context as well as the bigger picture. So the big picture, I think you described it well in that it follows that pattern that we've seen again and again throughout history of decadence and then collapse. And when you look at the Roman Empire, for example, the Western Roman Empire, it was welfare entitlements and unfunded liabilities that ultimately drove the debasement of the currency, that led to the weakening of the military, that ultimately led to the barbarian influx and the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And I think we can definitely see that same trajectory with our empire today, which I view as the American empire. I don't know why that's controversial for someone who looks at history, that we live in the Pax Americana, that Washington and New York now is the Rome. What Rome was in the first century is what the East Coast of the United States is now. And when you look at how bloated their expenditures have become, and particularly, I think we're beginning to see the pension funds across the United States start to go bang. And I see that as a big catalyst for a collapse of this system as we've come to know it, because and now I'm not an economist, and so I'm sure a lot of your viewers will listen to my amateur explanation in disdain. But at the federal level, they can always until there's a hyperinflation, they can always find a way to get out of some sort of fiscal crisis by printing, or doing what we're doing in Australia, importing capital by importing people. You can always make those sorts of decisions when you're at the federal level. But in the United States, and we might see the same problem here, there's a big problem, I think, at the state and municipal level, because they don't print currency. So there are fiscal constraints at those levels that we don't see at the higher level. And already we're seeing Illinois has essentially declared bankruptcy. I think some of the lawmakers in Illinois have gone on the record to say they should just dissolve the state. Dallas pension funds are in trouble, and CalPERS in California is illiquid. And this is a problem across many of parts of the United States. So I think that's how it's going to manifest in a big way in the States. In Europe, Japan, and Australia, I think it'll manifest differently. The European banks, there's nothing really holding them up. It won't take much to knock them over. And of course, in Japan, there's a gargantuan debt problem which will have to resolve itself some way. Here in Australia, I think we're in a slightly different situation. Your views might be different on this, Marcus, but I think here our big worry is private debt. Because we didn't have the correction in 2008 and 9 that, say, the United States and Britain had. And so we've just been doubling down on this leveraging. And so while I'm not sure that we'll have the same levels of public debt problems, they're the problems you really don't want to have. Because when the government can't keep its promises, really big things start to crack in a society. That's when you start to have really, really big catastrophic events. I think in Australia, we certainly seem to be headed for a rather brutal depression, much like we had in, say, the 1890s, and perhaps even worse, because our financial wizards at the RBA and in government offices have been able to keep this debt monstrosity going for so much longer. So our Minsky moment, when it finally happens, when we realise that all of these valuations of these assets are not what we thought that they were, I think that correction is going to be very brutal.
I would actually agree with you, because even if you look at, say, the 1890s, house prices then corrected by 50% and took nearly 40 years to recover. And that was on a gold standard where the private debt was 1/6 of what it is now. And you compare the past with the present, and it's just so much worse in terms of the fundamentals of where we are now.
And I wonder if, too, we don't have the political unity that we had back in the late 19th century. We've reached a point where special interests, let's say, are so accustomed to getting their way rather than the commonwealth, the common weal being a priority. I wonder if the response by our rulers will exacerbate the problem. And I think, we really... Well, yeah, I do. I think we're in for very tough times. I wouldn't want to scare anybody who's out there in your listening audience. And hey, I've been wrong now for quite a while, so you never know. I might keep being wrong, which is fine. But
we're always wrong until we're right.
Something. hey, that's right. But we're on a the planet, the country, it's finite, and with this infinite debt expansion model is madness. And Keynes himself, even the high priest of rampant debt, who laid the intellectual foundations. He provided the framework that it enabled central banks and governments to be so reckless, that then made us so reckless, because debt. We were incentivized to take on debt for decades now. Even he just was so flippant about it, and he said, well, hey, in the long run, we're all dead. And, he was a homosexual with no children. Maybe that plays a role. But if you think intergenerationally, I think we've been woefully irresponsible towards the young who are born now, let alone future generations who are as yet unborn. So I think we've got some hard lessons coming. And although it's going to be brutal, I think perhaps in the long run it'll be good for us as a nation, because Decadence is not fun, actually. There's always a hangover, and
there's a lot of unhappy people out there, I think too.
I think I don't want to sound like one of those old fire and brimstone preachers or something, but I do think it's not been good for our soul, for our happiness. There's a lot of miserable people, and reality is a much better place to live than delusion. And surely we've reached peak delusion by now. How much crazier can things get?
Very true. So moving along to your book that you recently published this year, which is called Civilizationism, what's the book about?
Yeah, so part of this journey that I started, I talked about earlier, and I know a lot of people have had the same trajectory. Once I realised, when I was a student and later a teacher, once I realised that so much of what I had believed in the past was phony, was wrong. Once you do that, then you have to begin building your own framework to try and understand how things really work. That sounds very vague, but you begin to think, well, okay, well, if what I read in the business section about how the economy works is bogus, because all of the models that economists use are based upon a false supposition that there's no such thing as debt, let's say, which is the case. Keynesian economics just denies the role of debt, which is crazy in a fiat currency system. But once you realize that, hey, the way that it's described to us about how things work doesn't work that way, then you have to go and find out for yourself to try and make your own understandings, because people need a framework to operate by. And so over the years, in all these different fields, I did that. I would go and try and find evidence I wanted to create an evidence-based framework that a person could use to operate confidently, so that I could know where to invest for our family, let's say, or I could understand what was going on with the culture so that our children can be best protected against the corruption and the decadence that I saw as a teacher. You see these lovely children who were just so delightful in their early adolescence, and then you see them in their early 20s and they've just been destroyed by alcohol and casual sex and just decadence, And so you want to, you have it in your mind, well, I don't want that for my children, so I have to make up my own mind about what's really important, that type of thing. So all of that came together in putting it together into a book, and that's what I did. So that's what I focused on in the book. So the book goes through, and in the book I go through and outline a couple of the different arenas where we've got big problems coming. So it deals with the threat of Islam, the economic situation, the cultural situation, where the ideology that's driving this agenda to destroy Western civilization, all of that. And at the end of the book, my conclusion at the time was that we need to come back to Christianity. Otherwise, we're going to be overwhelmed by all of these threats. Now, I still believe that, but these days I've realized that message, it's just not going to resonate with people who have become so burnt out when it comes to Christianity. So these days I talk a lot more about nationalism, and or maybe we'll talk about that later. But in the book, it was called Civilizationism, because my main argument was that we need to come back to a common identity in Christianity as a foundation of Western civilization. And we need to remember that, or else we're going to be overwhelmed. I still think that's true, but I don't know that it's the best way to get that message out anymore. So it's I've changed my emphasis in that case.
Okay, I'll go into religion with you a bit later on, but my next question would be, you have written about George Soros and the corruption among the political class in the US. Why do you think that's an important issue for people?
Yeah, that was fun. I during the election, I think it was in October, right when things were getting really intense. I did a piece for the Daily Caller attacking Soros, and what I noticed was that Soros's, and it got about 30,000 shares, which means there's probably maybe 100 to 200,000 people read it, and I think it got up his nose, because 6 weeks later he published an article in I think what's the name of this website. strategic. Oh no, I won't say it because I'll get it wrong. But there's a website that he basically owns, one of those phony intellectual websites that the establishment uses to get their ideas out. Very connected to the Council on Foreign Relations, that type of thing, intellectually bankrupt stuff. But he wrote a piece in there where he was defending his Open Society Foundations. What I criticised was that. His Open Society Foundation is very clearly based upon the ideological system that he was taught by Karl Popper at the London School of Economics. And so after the Second World War, after he was sold out his fellow Jews to the Nazis in Hungary, he went as a student to London and he studied under Karl Popper, who was a fellow Central European intellectual, let's say. And Karl Popper, in my view, he wrote a book, Open Society and Its Enemies. And when you read it, it looks on the surface like he's making a case for democracy. But when you look more deeply at how he's framing things, what he's doing is he critiques Marx in such a way as to make Marxism compatible to open, liberal, democratic political systems. And so Karl Popper developed that philosophical system, which was the basis of this open borders, globalist, anti-Western ideology that's now so rampant amongst our intellectuals. And now I'm not saying it all goes back to Karl Popper. He was part of a trend, but it really influenced George Soros. And so what I did was I wrote a piece exposing the neo-Marxist origins of the Open Societies Foundation, like what he's really on about. And I focus a lot on people like Soros, and it's not just Soros, but Soros is a good symbol. He's a good emblem for this problem because I think he's reckless and he's enough in the public eye that people are going to... It resonates now. And I think Soros shows a problem with democracy more generally. And, I'm not a political radical. I don't have a strong view on any particular political system. I think all of them have strengths and weaknesses. But a big problem with ours is that representative democracy allows moneyed interests and shadowy special foreign interests to capture the legislative and judicial and executive branches of power. And once that happens, and I think it happened in our societies a long time ago, then politicians become salesmen for policies, for directions and trends which are not in the interests of the people. And I think when we look at Brexit, when we look at Trump, I think when we look at this big backlash against globalism or whatever it is that's going on, I think that's got that in common, that for too long now our elites have been phony. They've been lying to the people about things like these sort of free trade agreements, which are really just the deindustrialization of the West. And it seems to me a program designed to transfer the wealth of the West to East Asia. And the more you look at, for example, the Clinton White House back in the 90s, there was money coming from China to fund his re-election in 96. And then we look throughout his presidency, that's really when that globalization pushed the open borders with China when it comes to intellectual property and money really opened up, and that fed that China boom. China would not be so powerful now were it not for, in my view, traitorous politicians and traitorous elites in the West. And why has that happened? Well, it's because, to answer my own question, it's because our rulers, our elites, they're not accountable to the people. The people, we have this delusion that the people are sovereign, and I think it's a myth that our political class is there to sell a message to us which has been determined by people who most of us probably don't even know about. And that's not right. If that's the way the system's going to be, then that has to be understood by the people. But the level of delusion and deception under which people in our societies operate is very, very bad, because it means there's no accountability for our rulers, and I think it's a big reason why our rulers are so corrupt. Yeah,
I agree with you. I think that the last 30 years in particular has been an absolute ramp-up escalation of corruption. I mean, Clinton basically sowed the seeds for the last global financial crisis when he removed the Glass-Steagall Act back in the late 90s. I mean, I don't think you could have even had the GFC without that kind of intervention. So, and certainly all the other nations around the world have played a part in the erosion of manufacturing from the West and its transfer to the East, which is certainly not a giant step forward for humanity, I don't think.
And then they tell us it's free markets. And then they get the lefties wound up because it's all this free market stuff that's ruined our economies and destroyed all of our jobs. It's the levels of deception are just...
well, as G. Edward Griffin said on an interview I did with him last year, that every public slogan is basically the opposite, or its name means the opposite. So the Federal Reserve it's not federal and it doesn't have any reserves. You know, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, it's not a free trade agreement. Thank God Trump got rid of it. But there's this constant attack, and everything we're told is the official reason for something. Look at Australia at the moment. They want to put chips on $100 notes. And the excuse is because pensioners are hoarding it. There's a move to remove cash out of the economy, because once cash is gone, the whole system's locked down. Right. You look at India, they've banned certain notes over there at the moment. You look at all these countries like Venezuela, where they've banned the use of Bitcoin. They've got 10% inflation per month. I mean, there's murders on the street. It's definitely falling apart. And I think the powers that be are basically making decisions early for God knows what's coming. So moving along, you call yourself a traditional nationalist. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, when I say traditional nationalist, what I mean by that is, for me, it's not just about fighting globalism with nationalism. And it's not just about fighting cultural Marxism with free speech. And it's not just about fighting open borders neoliberalism with economic protectionism or economic nationalism. My way of thinking is I've tried to look beyond all of those particular problems that we've got to what's the big problem? What's really behind all of these problems that is the big one that we want to solve? Because I think we're headed into such a period of crisis that periods like this are, of course, terrible. But there are also periods where you can be the most creative with coming up with solutions. And I think it's worth having a shot at really trying to get to the heart of why are we stuck in these cyclical patterns? Why is it that things have gotten this bad? And so my after long consideration of the problem, my view is that our main problem is modernity itself. So what it seems to me, and this I stole these ideas from lots of other people and cobbled them together, so it's not like I just came up with it in a cave, but I won't bore you with a reading list. But it seems to me that our problem is that around the time of the Enlightenment, let's say, with the decline of belief in metaphysical faith, and for us that's Christianity, but this is something that's happened across all the civilizations, is there's been a mass widespread loss of faith in metaphysical reality. And that's really, I think, the primary characteristic of modernity. If there's one thing that makes modernity different from all the periods before that, we're the one period which really doesn't believe that there's anything metaphysical. We're materialists. And that's I think the signal characteristic of the modern worldview. And I think it's at the heart of why modernity has been such a horror show. When you look across the world, modernity, yes, materially, we've created utopia. But I think in every other facet of life, we are more impoverished than anyone has ever been in all of human history. Spiritually, culturally, where all of those insubstantial, non-physical elements of life, we're impoverished. And I think that's because not only do we deny the reality of metaphysics and the non-physical elements of life, we think they're just conjured up by each individual. We think they don't really exist. Not only that, but we didn't change from being religious animals when we gave up on metaphysical faith. There's no such thing as a secular culture. There's no such thing as a secular society, and there's no such thing as a secular person. I think those are really core delusions of modernity. Man is a religious animal. Let's say we have a God-shaped hole inside us. If you're a Christian, you won't get triggered by that. But we are built for religion. For whatever the reason is, that's the way that we are. And what's replaced the traditional religions around the world has been, in my view, these secular religions, these utopian ideologies that can fall under the categories of liberalism or socialism. Ultimately, I think any of these modern ideologies, you can either put it in the category of being a sort of a liberal ideology or a socialist ideology. Liberalism is all about political equality, and socialism is all about economic equality. Both of them have in common that they're about creating some sort of utopian society, something that overcomes or transcends the problems of history. And I think that that's hubris, and it's a really big delusion. And when you look across at all those corpses of the 20th century, almost all of them were put into those mass graves by people who believed that all it was going to take was just one more corpse, and then utopia was going to break out. That's something in common with National Socialism, with the more extreme versions of fascism. You can see it with Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, all the way over to Cambodia. That they had in common that view that man can create utopia. And so when I say traditional nationalism, the traditional means that what I'm arguing for is we need to renounce utopianism in political thinking. We need to completely renounce any utopian vision of a way that we can create some sort of perfect society, because that's just created, whether it's with the massacres of the Marxist sort of ideologies, or even I think with the degeneracy and decadence of the liberal ideologies. And I know a lot of people might not like me saying that, and that's fair. It's a controversial point, but I think there's a problem with liberalism too, that it focuses too much on what the individual wants to do. And I think it always corrodes social rules. That for societies to function, there has to be a moral law in the hearts of the people that's roughly similar. And when societies, in my view, become too liberal, then I think you get just the society dissolves. You just have a collection of individuals because they don't have that. Anyway. But I think I'm on safer ground with your audience critiquing socialism, so I should stick with that. But I think these modern ideologies, these secular religions, we need to renounce them. And probably it means a return to some sort of metaphysical faith. I think Christianity is on the shelf. That's our traditional faith, so it would make most sense to go back to that. But I think we definitely need to renounce this modern disease of thinking that we can figure out what the problems of history are and then create utopia. So that's the traditional. This is a very long-winded answer. Stop me if I get tedious. But that's what I mean by traditional. I mean anti-modern. That's what I mean by that. And when I say nationalism, what I mean by that is I think that's a statement against globalism, and it's because I think that this movement that's happening, this political movement, I've come to the view, I think it has to be nationalist, because history operates dialectically. What I mean by that is you get these swings back and forward, and that's one thing that Marx got right, is you have these movements which create their own negation, and so we have the Russian Revolution there in 1917, which was all international communism. And then you can see there was an ideological reaction against that with the rise of fascism and National Socialism, And then they engendered their own dialectical response, where because fascism was seen to be so detestable by people after the Second World War, then we get cultural Marxism. This ideology that if you want to see what cultural Marxism is, just look at what Angela Merkel is doing. She is, I think, the pin-up girl for cultural Marxism, because she's just the most sterling example of someone who has just been programmed to destroy Western white civilization. And so I think because that's been so globalist, the dialectic reaction against it has to be nationalist. And I've noticed that when you start talking in terms of nationalism, that resonates with people. People want to find again that identity that they had before, and so that's why I frame it in terms of nationalism, because I think that's just going to be the movement, and I think you have to be aligned with where things are headed. And I see nationalism as coming. I think the debate is going to be what form of nationalism it might be, and yeah, I guess just what form it's going to take. I don't know. What would your views?
I think you're right. What we might do at the moment is we'll get onto technology for a second, and then we'll swing back onto religion and immigration, because we can probably elaborate a bit more on those areas. But one actual element of society, I guess, which really does fascinate me right now is how people just incorporate their smartphones into almost every part of their daily lives. I mean, you can see people now using their phones while they're riding a bicycle, while they're travelling on trains, walking down the street, getting married, etc., etc. And I'm acutely aware of the differences between the genders. For example, if I'm on a train going into the city, I'll usually always look out for what women are doing on their phones, and they're usually always on things like Facebook, whereas I only seem to see that kind of phenomenon with males about half the time. So to me, it's an awful trend. Phones are just taking over. They're taking over our conversations. They're reducing our face time with each other. I mean that in the physical sense. And it's a very big concern for me. What do you think about this phenomenon of technology, and where do you think it's taking humanity?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I saw it in education too, this technophilia, this worship of technology for its own sake, where schools would, as part of their marketing, and it really is a marketing ploy, parents need to wake up to this, schools would say they have a one-to-one laptop program, and as though that meant that they were a 21st century school or something like that. And I've said to my wife, we've got a toddler, I've said, if we can just find a school that says to me that they've banned devices and that kids have to write everything by hand in class, I will enroll our son there straight away, because I've seen it firsthand that these devices are the outsourcing of cognition. And I used to have this debate with fellow teachers who were on board with the technophilia, and they used to say, oh, but kids don't need to know anything because they can just look it up. They can just Google it. And that's not a fringe view. That's pretty much a mainstream view among educators these days, is knowledge is passé, it's old-fashioned, and even more than that, it's oppressive, and it's an old-fashioned model of education which is really repressive, and we just need to move beyond that. But it means that children are not only we think that they're getting a lot more information, or we think that they're learning a lot more because they're getting a lot more information, but they're not actually learning any more than their forefathers did. And I think they're actually learning less, because there's too much information, it's too chaotically presented, and there's no coherence, there's no structure. It's just, there are levels to organization of information, let's say. And at its base level, there's data. Then above that, there's information, which is when there's a little bit of structure starting to the concepts are starting to be linked. There's a bit of organization. Above that, we've got knowledge, which is what you would aim for as an outcome for any education system, is that a student who finishes can see comparisons between like and unlike objects, and make those comparisons, because they have those connections in their mind. They have that neural map already laid, so that then they can go out into the world and then conquer new vistas intellectually, because they've got a bit of intellectual hinterland in here to be able to make comparisons. And at the highest level, of course, you've got wisdom, which I think is very rare. But we're setting up a society where people don't move beyond information at all, and everything's just subject to the last Google search that you did. And I think it creates a slavish, very dependent, and a type of mentality, and a type of person who is they're very dependent on authority figures. They don't really think for themselves because they don't really know anything. I guess I think, because being an educator, that's how I would frame this issue of technology, is that, yes, of course, it's alienating us from each other and everything like that, but I think it's creating a type of person whose frame of thought is really only where they are now, and we're losing that ability, I think, to become that broader type thinker, which, if you want to have some sort of democratic society, it's crucial that you have.
Yeah, I think you're right there. There's the issue of the phones for adults, but as you pointed out, I'm in my mid-30s, so when I was at school, people didn't have their phones, and laptops were sort of black and white and nobody had one. But now it's a totally different situation, and I think that it's easy as an adult to kind of forget about the fact that if you've gone through school without all this interference, they're the formative years, and they're the years that you learn how to be a person. And these poor kids, they have nothing else to compare with. It's just this whole screen time. Everything's about being on a screen, and they bring psychologists into schools now because kids can't build empathy, and it's all just so weird. I've heard stories from teachers and principals about what goes on these days, and it's just horrifying. And a lot of the older ones can't wait to retire because they've just seen too much. But yeah, I think you're totally right. Moving back to religion now, obviously, as you've said before, you believe that religion is the glue that keeps civilizations on track and accountable. Now, I mean, this could be true, obviously, historically. There's definitely a case that that's correct. But I remain sceptical that it's the only way for humanity to succeed. For example, I was actually brought up by a father who was a Baptist minister. I went to an Anglican school. The majority of my extended family are strict Baptists. So you could basically say that I possess the ethics and the discipline of religion, but not the spiritual, God-believing elements. So you do believe that religion needs to be reignited, but couldn't you also agree that, aside from religion, if our society could still function, I think it could still function in a healthy manner, providing we have some sort of direction or ethics or purpose? Because I think, as you sort of touched on before, that the main issue here is that sort of since religion has kind of eroded, it's just been replaced with work and materialism. And in the case of Australia, we don't seem to have any identity. And if you go to the countries overseas, like in Asia, as you touched on before, you can kind of see this massive difference where there's more emphasis on family, on cohesion, on trust. Religion's still there. And they're sort of the building blocks of a civilization. But you can also see when you go to these third world countries that they're catching up to us. I mean, materialism has taken off. There's nice cars over there. Everyone wants to be like they are in the West, and that's probably a ticking time bomb as well, because I think that their religions and values will probably be on the way out as well as they emulate what we've done over here in the West. What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, at the risk again of being unpopular with, I'm sure, a large section of your audience, I'd put the blame there on liberalism. That I think that you could say it's materialism, but I think the materialism, the work addiction, and whatever, I think those behaviours flow from belief. I think that the belief systems work themselves out a certain way, and that I think what we're seeing in those Asian countries, and I saw it when I lived in Korea. And I'm pretty familiar with Japan as well. And those countries, in Korea, it was a Confucian country traditionally. And then in Japan, you've still got a hodgepodge. There was Shinto and Zen Buddhism and whatnot. But both of them had at their core an emphasis on two things: proper relationships and veneration of ancestors, and by extension, tradition. That connection with tradition. And that really grounded those societies, because if you have a mindset which venerates your ancestry, then you're also thinking to yourself that you're going to have descendants. it puts that in your mind. Your time frame is more than just your life. And when I was in Korea, it was still common around the time of around September, October. They have a festival. It translates as Thanksgiving. It's called Chuseok. And the whole country just turns into gridlock. You can't get anywhere during Chuseok because they're all driving to their ancestral homelands, which is usually some little village somewhere. The whole family will gather and they go to the ancestors' grave sites and they trim the grass. It's all done ceremonially. Now, they found a way for Christians to participate in that, so it didn't cause too many problems, and they've navigated all of that. But they still maintained those practices so that the families came together, and there was something other than, like you said, materialism, work, that rampant individualism. Whereas now, from what I understand, those, like our holidays, are just over time they get watered down. That people don't make it for Christmas. They move away and then you don't see each other for years, if not decades. You get that dissolving of the bonds of family. I do think one of the causes of that is I guess rampant individualism. The belief that the individual just needs to realize themselves and then they will be able to have some sort of meaning and fulfillment in life. And in my view, I think it's failed. I don't think it's worked for us. People would disagree, of course, but I don't think it has. So now you can't make the case to people and just say to them, we all need to get back to religion, though, because that's not how it works. I suspect we will see a rise in religion as this system that we're all inhabiting here, as the wheels start to fall off, like we saw at the fall of the Roman Empire. There was an increase in religious belief, and there was a decline in a belief in paganism, and then a rise in Christianity. Because as the material world starts to fall apart, I think people will go back to family. They'll go back to more of those traditional things. And I don't think it'll be because any guy on the internet argued that they should. I think those trends are determined by bigger things. But I guess what I would say in response to your assertion, and I think your view is held by most people today, that if we just had a certain ethics that determined behaviour, then that would be enough for society to thrive. I guess one question I might raise with that is, I think we need more than just rules to function, and humans need to believe that there's something bigger and that there's something transcendent and important in order to be able to get out of bed in the morning. And I think we've lost that. We don't have it. And I would love to see in this country that we again become men who will plant trees that their grandchildren will play under. That we regain that sense that there's something bigger than us, something more meaningful, because I think we'll be happier once we do. But at the moment we're lost in this nihilism, this self-absorption, and I think we need the transcendent in order to recapture that. Hey, maybe it's I hope it's not Islam, maybe it's not Christianity that does that, but I think something will fill that void, because if all we're living for is a comfortable retirement, what type of life is that?
Very true, and it's very arguable that it's not a life at all. I think you're on the right track. Whether it's materialism or the issue of liberalism or the different types of way that we're ruled, it's definitely a political and a rule of law issue as well. Austrian economics is obviously a different mode, and I would argue that liberalism and any model that's out there at the moment has its problems and probably won't work. But ultimately what we believe to be right and wrong is based on what's legal or not legal. There was once a time where you could smoke in bars. You can't do that anymore, and that's normal now. But it was also normal when you could smoke in bars. We used to give the death sentence for certain capital offences. That was considered normal. Now it's not. So I think John Locke, who was a legal philosopher long gone, who said that humans just basically start tabula rasa with a blank state, and they basically form, their norms are formed by whatever the rule of law is of the day, and that's constantly changing. I mean, right now it's perfectly normal to go down and fill your car up with petroleum, but maybe one day that'll be illegal. Maybe one day that'll be such a heinous crime that you could get your head cut off for burning fossil fuels. I mean, everything just constantly changes. But I think at the moment, like you said, that if there's no solidarity, if the politicians aren't serving the people, if you have all this interference, if you have countries filling up with different types of immigration on a massive scale, everything's just in disarray. And I think that's where it's at now. And as you said at the start of the video, that you can prolong the inevitable with importing people, rich people. That keeps the churning of money over in the economy, keeps the GDP going, and but it's not good for us in the long run. It's sort of like drugs. It might have a short-term benefit, but in the long run, it's no good. Moving on to homosexuality and transgender identities within our schools. This is a horrifying subject I've been looking at lately. I'd like to get your thoughts on it, but basically in Australia we do have a federal funded program which is called it's in the primary and secondary schools mainly. It's known as the SSCA, and they recently actually published a booklet which was sent out to teachers titled OMG, I'm Trans. So the whole aim of this program is to normalise homosexuality and transgender identities with children at school in an attempt to basically reduce bullying, which to me just seems massively dangerous because it installs some very radical ideas into children at a time when they're not mature enough to contemplate these sorts of issues. Here's actually what Camille Paglia, I think her name is, said about homosexuality and transgender in children.
Permanent changes in your body with which there's no going back. Okay, I mean, for me, you know, a sex change operation opens one door but closes many others. Right? So I personally believe that anyone who collaborates in an intrusion into a developing child's body and mind is guilty of child abuse, a crime against humanity, okay, because that child is not prepared to make such a decision, okay. I think that such decisions about sex reassignment surgery must wait when one attains a majority, which would be, it seems to me, a minimum of age 18. I'm very concerned with this because I think that it's become a fashion, okay, that the transgender definition has become a kind of convenient label for young people who may simply feel alienated, okay, culturally for many other reasons, okay. So that in the 1950s they might have become a beatnik, in the 1960s they might have become a hippie and taken mind-expanding drugs, okay. And so today you're encouraged to think that it's an alienation is because you are not totally defined, identifying with your particular inherited gender definition. So I'm very concerned about this. I think that a lot of it, I think that the collaboration of the bureaucratic machinery with it has to do with the assault on masculinity, okay? Okay, the more I explored it, I realized that that historically the movement toward androgyny occurs in late phases of culture, okay? As a civilization is starting to unravel, okay, and that you can find it again and again and again through history in the Greek art, okay? You can see it happening. All of a sudden, okay, there's a kind of there's the sculptures of handsome nude young men athletes that used to be very robust, okay, in the archaic period suddenly began to seem like wet noodles, okay, toward the end, okay, and that the people who live in such periods, a late phase of culture, whether it's the Hellenistic era, whether it's the Roman Empire, whether it's the mauve decade of Oscar Wilde in the 1890s, whether it's Weimar Germany. People who live at such times, okay, feel that they're very sophisticated, they're very cosmopolitan, okay, and homosexuality, heterosexuality, so what, anything goes, and so on. All right, and so, from the perspective of historical distance, okay, you can see that it's a culture that no longer believes in itself, okay, and then what you invariably get are people who are convinced of the power of heroic masculinity, okay, on the edges, whether they're the Vandals and the Huns, okay, or whether they're the barbarians of ISIS, okay, you see them, starting to mass on the outsides of the culture, and that's what we have right now. That there is a tremendous and rather terrifying disconnect between the infatuation with the transgender movement in our own culture and what's going on out there, okay, all right? And so I mean, that's why I'm concerned. I feel it's ominous, okay? I question whether the transgender choice is indeed genuine in every single case. But what concerns me is when well-meaning adults, believe that they're helping people by making it easier some permanent change in the body from which there is no goal.
And when you're a traditionalist about these things, it's going to be something that concerns a lot of people because I've met a lot of gay people, and certainly I'm not at all interested in some sort of program where you want to persecute people or something like that. I don't think that's the way for a society to deal with these things. That being said, I think there will always be people who want to follow those types of lifestyles. Throughout history, you can see even in the most conservative of cultures, you could see that there was always underground culturally, there was always that thread. And I think a type of lifestyle like homosexuality, like any of those types of non-normative sexual practices, it really needs to be in the closet. And I think it just has to be that way because at the end of the day, we have to make a consideration. Do we determine all of our beliefs and practices based upon what is the best for individuals, or do we prioritize the what will maintain the health of the community and of the society? And I do not think you can make the case honestly that it is in the interests of society for children to become homosexual, or even this trans thing, which is really, I think, just an extension of the same agenda. When you look at the health outcomes of people who are homosexual, when you look at suicide rates, when you look at a lot of people who've become homosexual themselves, we saw that with the Milo issue that came out, that Milo was molested when he was an adolescent, and the way he's internalized that was to become himself a homosexual. Now, people won't get triggered by saying something like that because they'll say you're born that way. I don't understand how you can say that someone is born that way when you're actively trying to condition society to make more kids gay. Like, it's not honest. We're dealing with an agenda that's not honest and not straightforward. And when you've got a society that is encouraging its young to become gay, to become transgender, you have a society that is predating upon its children. That's a society that has so completely lost its way that it's not long for this world. There's a reason why traditional normative moral beliefs were held by people, because over millennia human beings learned the very hard way that those are the moral practices which a society must have in order to continue into the future. And when these rabid minorities are able to capture our education system and corrupt our children with these types of beliefs, then we've reached a stage where, this is why for me conservatism is dead. Because if you're a conservative out there listening, I respect you, but what have you conserved? What's left? If the point of conservatism was to keep something in the cupboard is bare. Like they've raided
Yeah,
everything in
that's
our
right.
culture now, and now we're at the point where we've got little kids who are being taken seriously. There was a story where sorry to talk about celebrities, but I think it's Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. One of their children now has come out as transgender, and I just look at that and I just think how decadent do we have to be before the this sounds weird, but before the meteors start raining down from the sky.
Yeah.
Like this is it's just gotten insane. And the fact that we've got publicly funded broadcasters who are who are defending and perpetuating these ideologies. Now what I see is happening here, because we could critique and complain about all of these things all we like, but what I always try and look at is what's the spirit or the thing behind this agenda. And I think we're looking at a war on men. And not only that, I think we are, and I think we have to acknowledge this, I think we're looking at a war particularly on white men. Now, I mentioned before about ideologies and what I think is best called cultural Marxism. Now, this ideological belief system, it came out of the work of Marxists during the early 20th century. And for those who aren't familiar with it, just in broad strokes, what happened was when the Russian Revolution failed to spread into the West, the Marxist intellectuals in Western countries at the time, they didn't just suddenly say to themselves, oh, gee, I guess capitalism was right. I guess, Marx was wrong. We should all just start up a small business. They didn't do that. Being fanatics the way that they are, they instead, through there was a whole bunch of thinkers who developed the ideas, and they came to the consensus that what prevented the spread of the Marxist revolution outside Russia was a couple of things. It was capitalism, but also it was Christianity and the moral foundations that Christianity had laid. And they identified that they needed to take down the culture so that then it could lay the foundations for Marxism to spread into the countries. And so Eastern Marxism is classical Marxism. That's like your the Marxist-Leninist dialectic, the stuff that Marx actually wrote about. That was what was implemented in the East, and it destroyed their economies and it destroyed them politically for a whole human lifetime. About 70 years, it just put Eurasia under ice. In the West, the form Marxism took was cultural Marxism. And it's the Marxist dialectic applied to identity and culture instead of class. And it's been able to operate unimpeded because we've been very naive and very gullible about how it works. So when the New Left in the late 1960s took control of the campuses across the West, people took them at their word that this was some idealistic movement just to set people free and it was all about love. It was complete lies. At the heart of that New Left ideology, which is still the ideology of our education system today, was a determination to destroy the foundations of Western civilization. That has meant the destruction of whites, the importing of people from foreign lands so that evil, patriarchal, sexist, racist, Islamophobic white males can be eradicated completely, and we can have diversity and we can have this utopia. Now, of course, it doesn't make any sense because largely they're bringing in Muslims, and I really don't, the cultural Marxists are going to be the first to get thrown off the roof once ISIS takes over. But these people aren't rational. They're not sane. And that's why we need to stop taking them at their word and we need to start to fight, because it's really getting crazy when you've got people taking it seriously that a little kid thinks that a little kid could be born the wrong gender. Like, when are we just going to say enough?
Very true. You've just touched on immigration, so I guess we'll move on to that topic now. If you live in Melbourne, which you don't, but I do, but if you live in Melbourne, you would have noticed an explosion in the population over the past few years, with our population actually increasing by 300,000 in just the last 3 years alone. Now, the traffic in Melbourne has become an absolute nightmare, and there's also an explosion in new shitty apartments. I'll put some photos up on the screen to have a look at, which they're just horrendous. I mean, you wouldn't have anything live in that. But our former Premier, Jeff Kennett, actually described the current paradigm of apartments as basically looking like dogs' kennels. Now, personally, I don't think this is a giant leap forward for humanity, and there doesn't appear to be any end to this current trend right now in terms of further immigration volumes increasing or at least remaining where they are at the moment. Now, a lot of these new entrants into Australia are Chinese, and what makes me really angry is that a lot of these Chinese are filthy rich. It's not like in the 50s when we had the poor Europeans coming over in the boats. These new rich Chinese, they haven't actually done, a lot of them anyway, haven't done a lot in terms of productively making or earning their wealth in, say, manufacturing. Most of them have actually done it in the real estate and stock bubbles overseas, and they've now laundered that money and brought it into Australia illegally, because in their country they can only export about 5,000 yuan per year, which is around about $3,500 Australian. So what we're actually seeing in front of our eyes right now is the acquisition of massive houses and mansions in the iconic suburbs of Melbourne by the Chinese, and this is in fact sadly a quiet coup d'etat of criminality, which is basically driving a massive wealth gap at the expense and prosperity of ordinary Australians. Now, I guess some people might be looking to label me a racist right now, but I'm not. But it's also worth remembering that in many other Asian nations like China and Japan, the same government programs that we have here are not allowed in their countries. For example, an Australian can't just move to China and start a business. You'd actually have to give half of the ownership of the company to a Chinese citizen. And additionally, Australians can't own critical infrastructure in China, such as phone companies or airlines or power plants, and yet in Australia most of our power infrastructure has already been sold off to the Chinese and Japanese, and now we're surprised that the power prices have gone up 60% in the last couple of years. So what's your thoughts?
I think it comes back to that issue of sovereignty that I was touching on earlier, that we have a system where our politicians have just become so accustomed to lying to us. They just give us a spiel that's designed to fit into a narrative which people have been programmed with, that such basic considerations as, is Australia a sovereign nation for the people of Australia, that doesn't enter into the way of thinking of people in our elites. And when ASIO is raising concerns about Chinese money flowing to federal politicians, I looked at that with great interest, because for ASIO to do that, it means that that must just be the tip of the iceberg. You don't if you're an domestic intelligence agency, you wouldn't engage in such a fashion with federal politics unless people are really fed up with seeing how the sovereignty of the nation is being compromised. And I see this as an issue across the board. I think there's a problem with the way our foreign policy in the Middle East, for example, which is where most of our military expenditure over the last 15 years has gone, how that's being driven by foreign interests. It's not an Australian national interest to go and blow up yet another Middle Eastern country over there. And of course, our leaders would say, well, it's the United States that's making those decisions. But I think that's just the same problem, that we've got the tail wagging the dog across a whole range of areas of life these days. And I guess what my concern, I guess, would be, or my point would be, you can't have rates of immigration like what you were talking about, and there not be some sort of very aggressive backlash. And Australia has a history of when people see that foreigners, particularly Chinese, are taking it in their minds, taking advantage of the openness or the universalism of the way that our culture operates. When people, when the economy turns down and that perception bites with people, then things can get very ugly. And we've seen that multiple times already throughout our history, and I think we will have the same thing happen again. Unfortunately, there will be a lot of people who will blame the Chinese themselves for coming. And in my view, I don't blame those foreigners for taking advantage of the corruption of our elites. My rage is directed against those elites who have betrayed us like that. And I think this is going to be a bigger and bigger issue, because the rates of immigration that we've had it's historically unprecedented. It's civilization ending. Like I was saying before about the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. What historians have ultimately considered to be the collapse of the empire was the influx of massive numbers of Germanic barbarians into the empire. And you just can't have that and still pretend that everybody's Roman. So when you've got millions of Asians coming into Australia, and many of them, like you intimated before, they're not coming in and working in small businesses and getting to know Australians and really working like we saw with that post-war immigration. They're not following that route. What they're doing is they are transferring their Shanghai or Kuala Lumpur or Seoul lifestyle into a different economic zone, and it's just a different economic zone for them. They have no attachment to the nation. It's not that they're not even civic minded in that regard. They are coming to form enclaves. I don't blame them for doing it, but it's got to stop, because no nation can carry on with that. We need to look at some of the delusions of multiculturalism, show it up for the foolishness that it was, and come back to a much saner approach to not only to our national identity but also to how we handle immigration, because our elites have really set us up for a lot of anger, I think, and it's very unfortunate, because I think should that anger fall upon the people who've actually come and taken advantage of our government's treason, then I think that'll be very unfortunate, because it's not their fault.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I also think that, as I said before, it's a one-way street. We can't go in there and do what they can do over here. So it's not even. I mean, if it was a two-way street, if we could go to some of these Asian nations and do exactly what they're doing here, maybe you could argue that's kind of fair. But we can't, and it's one set of rules for them and one set of rules for us, and that's not fair. And it's definitely, as you said, I don't think it's sustainable. Just moving along to some of the signs of a collapsing empire. We're getting towards the end of this interview, but I'll just bring up an issue, and then maybe you can quickly give us your thoughts on that topic in terms of the context of where humanity is today. So I guess feminism we've already touched on. What about the banking system?
Yeah, that's a big one. I think, if there is a shadowy elite that rules the world on behalf of very evil forces, then I see central banking as the ring of power that sort of holds it all together. I think we need to have sovereignty over money creation again. I think it's a very important issue that it's a controversial topic, and I think people have different ideas, but I do think the way that money is created and the interest that serves, and how, and ultimately who controls the levers of the central banks. I think that's another issue that comes back to sovereignty. This is why I've come to the view that nationalism is important, because sovereignty matters. And when you have a central bank that ultimately it's staffed by people who themselves are going into the big four banks later on in their careers to get their lucre, and it also is intimately interwoven with not only the big international banks, but it reports to the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, which is a that's just such a bizarre arrangement. Like, And I think it was this nexus of central banks, which ultimately report to the BIS, was the forerunner of globalism. I think this agenda, this globalist agenda, which has really only reached the public consciousness in the last couple of years, this has been a long-term plan for a lot of people. You can read the books, you can read their white papers. This has been wanted for a long time, and I think the way that the banking system operates is very, very crooked, and we could see the power that the banking system has when the global financial crisis hit, and it's astonishing when you think about it that essentially the bankers on Wall Street were able to hold the American political establishment hostage, and in a very, very brief period of time, they essentially confiscated multiples of GDP in time. Like over time, when you look at how much money was given by governments to the banking system, and that was done just because of a threat that the bankers were going to pull the plug on the system. I think that revealed where sovereignty lies, and it's a very big issue. And then if we bring that down to the local level of what's happened in Australia, It saddens me so deeply that this country has believed the propaganda that a housing bubble is in the interests of the people of the country. Like there may have been some amongst the boomer generation who benefited from the massive increase that we saw in house prices from, say 2000 to 2010, or if you live in Sydney or Melbourne till today. There have been people who on paper have certainly seemed to benefit. But when you look at what they've done, it hasn't been good for them, because many of them consumed that wealth by borrowing against the increase in their property. And then the only way you were going to really make a killing was get in on the ground early, buy multiples, they rise, and then you sell them, or you downsize your own house in anticipation of prices correcting, and then you live off the excess. Nobody's done that. Like,
all
nobody's done that.
Their equity's gone up, and they've bought another property and another property, and it's like these reinforcing loops we were talking about at the beginning. It's they don't sell that property and then start a business. They do what's easy. They just buy another property. And so when they've got all their risk in one asset class, and when it comes down, it's just devastating. But I find it very hard to get this into the minds of people. There is a healthy way that the banks are meant to work. They're meant to loan money to businesses. And if you look at their balance sheets, if you find that the majority of their loans are to business, you've basically got a healthy economy. So if you look at Australia back in the 1980s, the majority of the bank's balance sheet was loans to business. So at that point, you can have a house that's only 4 years annual income. But once you kill off those productive loans and then start inflating asset bubbles in say, housing, the house prices become out of step with reality. I mean, in Melbourne, $1 million gets you a shithole. And yet there are plenty of people out there only earning $50,000 a year. And you would think that people would be rioting on the streets, but they just put up with it, or their parents help them out with a deposit, or they get their inheritance early, or there's some sort of manipulation that's allowing them to be able to somehow exist, or they just rent. They don't even worry about buying a property. But it's just so... It's so sad that people don't even understand what healthy looks like. I mean, I spoke at the beginning about causal loop diagrams and how systems can be modelled. Well, most people don't smoke cigarettes because that's bad for your health. You can map that out on a causal loop diagram. You can also map out the banks on a causal loop diagram, and yet people have this, they're so aware of health in terms of what they eat and fitness and smoking and alcohol and all that sort of thing. And then when it comes to the economy or what they're doing with their investments or buying into houses, they're just totally oblivious. And they don't even spend 5 minutes going to look for the answers. They're happy to sign multi-million-dollar mortgage contracts without doing any homework whatsoever. It's amazing.
And when you look at how, because I'm very, very cynical about how the financial system operates, and probably more cynical than most. But the way that I see it is, mortgages, the mortgage industry, it's become a way to farm the productive wealth of the nation. You've got people now who are paying so much back to the banks that, and ultimately the big four banks, if we consider that they are also owned by international banks as well, like it really begins to resemble a plantation. And I put this in one of my pieces that, on the global debt plantation, you're not a slave, you're the cotton.
That's so true.
It's this method of just extracting from the productive wealth. And so people are working so hard, and they're not seeing their kids. The mother and the father are both out, giving up their best hours of their lives to this system, making these repayments, thinking that they're wealthy because they get to inhabit this house that. The house was there before it was worth $1 million. It was still there when it was worth a quarter of that. And if you'd been working that much and not giving so much money to the bank, you would have been able to maybe free up some time to spend with the child.
That's exactly right.
Or even just to like you said, start a business if you're that way inclined, or even just have some leisure, go to Bonnie Doon, and get your boat out. Like that's what Australian life used to be like.
Exactly.
But now it's we're mad. Like really,
yeah, it's totally mad. And yet someone was saying to me the other day, they were quoting someone long dead who said back in the 1930s, I think we're being farmed. And if you look at how much worse it is now than, say, the 1930s, where a plumber could be married with 2 kids and still easily afford to support that family on one income, if they thought we were getting farmed back then, we're certainly in cages now by comparison. So it is very sad. I did interview Jim Rogers last year, actually, and he said that we need a multitude of medium of exchanges to use as money and not just have one type, because that's the real issue here, is that we don't settle any of our purchasing in anything other than fiat currency. And so the value of that currency, who gets it, who doesn't, is all determined by central planning. It's a total scam. And if we had gold, if we had silver, if we had Bitcoin, anything else, God, even if we had credit ledgers, barter, anything, to take off some of that load and replace it with a system which is far more sustainable. Steve Keen, who I interviewed last year, he believes that the current system is okay, providing it's overhauled to stop the banks from creating asset bubbles. My problem with that is that if that was to happen tomorrow, some idiot will unwind it in 60 years' time from now. So as much as I can see all the problems with gold standards, and I can see that they never last anyway, I have a real difficulty believing that we can just eradicate the problem permanently by changing it now, because you've got to look at humanity as more than one human lifetime. In 200 years' time, when we're all long gone, there'll be some moron who'll be trying to teach everyone that they should just move off a Bitcoin standard, for example, and move back onto paper. And I think Bitcoin's a very interesting phenomenon, because I think that what may happen with Bitcoin is like what we saw with Facebook, where it begins, it's kind of used for just, as digital gold, or as a cheap way of transacting money between countries, because that whole system is very expensive in the current state that it operates with, the bank wires and all that sort of thing. But once businesses get on to using Bitcoin, once people the average person starts using it as a medium of exchange, we could find in just 1, 2 or 3 years' time from now that like 10% of the economy is suddenly being used on cryptocurrency. And then we could find that 5 years from now, half the economy has just flipped over to it. And it's not outside of the realm of possibility. I mean, I think people, when they do get this idea in their head that the banking system is just basically legalised theft of prosperity, I think that that this could just move like wildfire just throughout the economy, and suddenly everything's changed. I mean, you look at, say, Japan. They've now classified Bitcoin as a currency, as a medium of exchange. So we may find that other governments do that. I mean, it's difficult to see where it's going, but it's possible that maybe the private sector will just get on with life anyway, and they'll just ignore governments, and they'll just, we'll just put our money in Bitcoin, because that's not being eroded by inflation. It's going up all the time. It's now $3,500. It was $600 2 years ago. We'll just stick it there, and we'll make our big purchases with that. And then all of a sudden, 5 years from now, we may find that the planet has become a totally different place. People have woken up. They're moving away from traditional currencies. Who knows? I think it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, and I think it has to happen if it's cryptocurrencies or something. Something has to give, because people are losing confidence in the system generally, and I think that will only accelerate as economic conditions get worse, which is the general trend when you have deflation, which seems to be what we're headed into. So I think as that confidence erodes, then and people become more aware of these things, something will have to give. I don't know enough about the cryptocurrencies. It's not something that I've really looked into, but I think generally what we're in for is a period, and probably in a very extended period, I think, where we've reached peak economic globalism, this peak interconnectivity. I see people moving back to, and not just because I wish it would happen, I really do see this on the horizon, that people will come back to a much more local way of living. And so I think it's not too far off before people perhaps start to grow their own food again in their own lots, and then we have local markets and things like that. What they use as a means of exchange, I don't know. It may well be cryptocurrencies or something. But I think we've become as abstract, as global, as interconnected as possible, and I think that there's a rebellion against that, and I think it'll be good for all of us to come back to a much more grounded and real way of living.
I very much agree with you. Now, one of the last questions now is, what are you doing in terms of preparations, if any? Are you doing anything for yourself and your family, or what's the situation there?
Yeah. Goes through stages, to be honest. So we've got some food security there. I guess with this type of thing, the point I reached in my thinking is, every man, and usually it's men who are thinking about these types of things. That's not sexist. It's just reality. Every man has to, when taking care of his family, he has to look at what he thinks is going to happen and make contingency for that level of preparation. So, if you think that it's going to get really bad, really fast, by all means, build your bunker, get your deep pantry, get your super male vitality, your water purifiers, and all of that stuff, And I know people who have gone down that road, and kudos to them for doing that. In my view, I think I used to think that it was going to happen very suddenly, especially when I believed in the quantity theory of money. I thought that the dollar could go to zero overnight. I don't believe that anymore. I don't think that's how it works. I think it's more complex, and I think what we're headed into, I suspect, will be a couple of decades of a grinding down, where at the end of it we'll look back and realize that it's all gone, that life is going to be very different from then on. But I think this collapse process, which is what we're going into, I believe, I think it will take a couple of decades. So in our household, we're big believers in precious metals as one way of storing value for the future. Not being a finance or economics guy, take this with a grain of salt. But what I would say to people is, don't hold your precious metals for too long. Like a lot of people in 1980 and 2011, they held it all the way through the boom, the bubble, and I think if and when precious metals do take off, it itself will also be a bubble, and all bubbles pop. So my view is, and like I said, take it with a grain of salt, but I think don't hold on to it for too long. This is going to be a thing which has stages of stages of catastrophe, seeming recovery, and then further problems. If we have a war, then you're going to need food security. Famine always follows war, as does disease. We've talked about a financial crisis. In that case, you want to be careful where you put your money. And like everybody in this arena, my primary thing for our family is to make sure we're debt free. So we've made sure of that, and whatever savings we have, we've tried to put in tangibles. And also down the road, our plan over the next 5 to 10 years, what we still rent now because it's just not been. I've in my family's history, my great-grandfather, he was very well off, and they had a sheep station, and he sold up the sheep station and bought up all of the shops on one side of the main road in in Wagga in New South Wales. When the Depression hit, they lost everything and they became very poor, and that story stayed in the family. So that stuck with me. So we don't own, and we're hoping to own one day when things become a bit more when that becomes a bit more realistic. But ultimately, with a view to growing our own food and becoming independent that way, because I think it might take a couple of decades, but I think we are looking towards a future which I hope isn't Mad Max, but maybe will be a lot more like like towards the end of the Western Roman Empire, when people's worlds became a lot smaller, and it became much more about what you can grow and share with people around you. I know that will seem crazy to say to most people in Australia today, when we still go into the supermarket and it's just this cornucopia. But I think history shows us things can change, and over the next couple of decades, I don't think we'll have that bounty the way that we've had in recent decades.
Great. Well, that's a wrap up for this interview. Where can people look further into your work?
Oh yeah. Okay. So my the website is restoringaustralia.net. Or if you just look up Moses Apostaticus, I write for XYZ and a couple of other places around the traps, and yeah. So we're I have a YouTube channel and whatnot. So they can find my stuff there, and you can read and comment and tell me how everything that I write and say is wrong, and we can have a debate about it.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for coming on the show. It's good to get you on, and hopefully we'll do another one of these soon.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Moses.